There's a lot of anticipation for these debates, but I have to ask, do debates even matter? Like, can they actually change a race? Do they have anything to do with what wins voters over?
They can in the primaries. There is not a lot of evidence that debates change voters' opinions once we get to the general. That what they typically do is just harden the opinions that people bring to the debate. But in primaries, they actually can have somewhat larger effect because the cue of party is absent. So a Democrat who is marginally supportive of one candidate or another, they are attentive, they watch the debate. The things that happen there they can affect the race. It's unlikely that among the candidates who are polling at 1 or 2% that they're going to become a front runner overnight. But it's possible that some of the candidates who are running in the single digits might be able to use this to introduce themselves to a national audience. So I don't think this debate or the next few debates are going to turn the race on its head. But if we go back to 2016 and 2012, there's some evidence that the debate performances had the effect of driving people out of the race when it became clear that they had no meaningful shot to the nomination. So it's not going to decide the race, but I think it can have a material effect on the size of the field and the relative standing of at least distinguishing between the first tier and the second tier candidates.
With so many candidates on stage and so little time to talk per candidate, what do you think candidates would be smarter to focus on, the issues or trying to impress their personality on the voters?
I've been trying to work this out, trying to think if I were advising a candidate, what advice could one give? And if you do the math, it's a 2-hour debate. There are 10 candidates. Once and there are going to be commercials and moderation breaks where people are coming and going from the moderator's desk. And so once you subtract the opening and closing statements, we're probably talking about in the range of 6 or 7 minutes per candidate, and in a format that is really going to tax viewers' attention. Think about moderator asks a question, and are they going to ask the question of Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden first? Or are they going to randomly decide who gets to go first? But if they ask a question and they go through all 10 candidates, by candidate 6 or 7, it's likely that viewers are going to be less attentive than they were at the beginning. And so the most memorable moments of debates are rarely policy statements. They are the zingers, they are the flubs, they are the gaffes, they are Ronald Reagan, I'm paying for this microphone, or Rick Perry forgetting the names of the agencies that he wants to eliminate. And it's kind of hard to think of how the debates might be covered from a policy perspective, because in a newspaper article or a 2-minute NBC News story, there's no way they're going to get through all 10 of the candidates or all 20 of the candidates. And so I think that really poses a challenge to the candidates and the moderator's ability to maintain control. And it's also worth noting that we still don't know what the ground rules are. We don't know what the format is going to be, how long the candidates are going to be given to talk, how long or how the moderators will handle interruptions, and if somebody attacks Elizabeth Warren or Joe Biden, do they have a chance to respond? And so there is at least some chance that this could become a chaotic free-for-all, which I mean, I've been struggling to sort of work out how well this is going to work.
Yeah, the Democrats have never really had anything like of this nature before. The Republicans did in 2016 when there were, 17 candidates running, and I think they had like that many on stage. What did you kind of learn from that in terms of what to expect?
So each election cycle, there is a tendency for the party that lost in the previous cycle to think about their rules and consider revising their procedures. And it's what the Republican Party did after 2012, when the large number of debates encouraged the candidates to go after each other. And so the format in 2016 was a reaction to that. And I think there's pretty broad consensus that the way that was handled, with an undercard debate 2 hours before the prime time debate, that didn't work, in the sense that there was no candidate in the undercard debate who made it very far into the process. And I think that the Democrats are clearly reacting to the view that in 2016 that the party put its thumb on the scale for Hillary Clinton. A small number of debates scheduled at inconvenient times when not a lot of people were going to watch. And there were a lot of Sanders supporters who were deeply unhappy at what they saw, what they claimed was an outright attempt by the party to essentially deliver the nomination to Clinton. And there's some evidence that a material number of Sanders supporters either sat out in the general election or voted for a third party candidate. And so the number of debates and the openness, the qualification requirements are pretty easy for candidates to meet. And so now it seems like they have oscillated to the other side, where they have 20 debates and several candidates who are not included, who are unhappy. And it's not entirely clear to me how well this format is going to work in terms of delivering meaningful information to voters and providing a way for people who might be unsure to decide what they think of the candidates.
So when you say like meaningful information to voters, that's really interesting to me, because I don't think anybody, or there seems to be a lot of confusion out there about what compels voters. Right now, Politico's Morning Consult says that most Biden supporters, their second choice is Bernie Sanders, and vice versa. And I think that's a little strange to some people, because they couldn't be more different in terms of where they are on the scale of like progressiveness in the Democratic Party. So I want to ask you, what causes people to attach to one candidate or another, especially in these situations?
Yeah, part of it at this point is going to be familiarity. People know who Joe Biden is. People know who Bernie Sanders is. Democratic voters know who Elizabeth Warren is. Now, Seth Moulton, Jay Inslee, and Andrew Yang, maybe not so much. But clearly people bring their priors to their evaluation of the candidates. But things can be unstable. What I tell my students, and it's become kind of a dated example, but it still holds true, that in December 2003, the month before the Democratic primary, the Iowa caucuses, the top three Democratic candidates were Howard Dean, Richard Gephardt, and Wesley Clark. And within a month, they were all out. And so there's a limit to how much importance or how much emphasis, how much weight you can put on polls this early. And you can go back to the Republicans in 2016, the Republicans in 2012, when Ben Carson and Rick Perry and Scott Walker were all bouncing around at the top of the polls, and it's the farther away we are from the election, the less informative polls are. And even the polls that, pretty clearly it's Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, who are sort of in the first tier, and there are going to be some others too. But there are a lot of candidates. I think I counted there of the 20 candidates in the two nights, there are only 7 who are polling above 1%. And that in a multi-candidate race, if Bernie Sanders really does go after Joe Biden, is that going to change the way that Biden supporters view him as a second choice? And the formal modelers and mathematicians who think about the dynamics of a candidate race. In a two-candidate race, they're worked out pretty well. Three-candidate race, there's no equilibrium, and in a 20-candidate race, it's just not. We can make some general statements that somebody who was polling at 1% or 2% has a vanishingly small chance of remaining competitive. But if you look at the top 4 or 5 candidates, which is really, I think, what the candidates who have a meaningful chance of actually lasting or getting the nomination, there are a lot of things that can happen. Joe Biden says something that causes people to scratch their heads, or Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders start going after each other, and there are a lot of things that could affect the dynamics of the race. And a debate in this kind of setting is one piece of that. But I think it's really unlikely that the Democrats will get to July of 2020 and someone will point to an event in the first debate saying, aha, that was the pivotal moment.
So do any of your students recognize the names Dick Gephardt, Wesley Clark, or Howard Dean?
Not anymore. You might as well be talking about Grover Cleveland and James Buchanan. But it does make the point that even a month before the election, and there are examples from 2016 that the example of Donald Trump. I mean, normally you would say that Andrew Yang and Marianne Williamson have zero chance. But that's kind of what the pundits and pollsters and party folks were saying about Donald Trump in June of 2015. So the conventional wisdom is not quite as ironclad as it might have been, but I think it is manifestly true that many of the candidates are running not because they think they have a chance to win the nomination, but they're trying to make a point and have their say and influence what the party positions and what the party does.
So these debates are for the Democratic primary, and presumably that's going to be the majority of the people watching them, but obviously a lot of other people are also going to be watching, including swing voters. How much should candidates think about tailoring their message to only primary voters versus general election voters?
Well, at this point, candidates are focusing on the Democratic base. It's not if I'm Elizabeth Warren, I'm not really worrying about what an independent voter in Ohio thinks just yet. I mean, I might have some indication that I will have to take positions that ultimately might appeal to them, but you got to get through Iowa, New Hampshire, and Super Tuesday first. And there is against part of the conventional wisdom that candidates in the primaries, it's more important for them to appeal to the base, and that once they become, they're confident that they're going to get the nomination, they start moving to a general election footing. But I don't think, I don't think we're going to see a lot of candidates who are appealing explicitly to independent voters. And if they do, they will express it in terms of positioning themselves with respect to the president. But this is about mobilizing and motivating the base at this point, because we're still, what is this, June? So we're still 7 months out or 6 months out from the Iowa caucuses. And the things that candidates have to be concerned about are building their organization and crafting a message and mobilizing and field operations and grassroots and turnout. So I think strategically that's a bigger consideration now than worrying about what might happen 14 months from now.
So just kind of want to talk about some of the front-running candidates one at a time, if you don't mind. First of all, Bernie Sanders. I think there was a sense a few months ago that Bernie Sanders was the front-runner, and now he's actually slipped below 20% in the polling. which I think surprised not only his supporters, but people that weren't supporting him. Why do you think he's struggling to capitalize on his popularity from 2016?
Well, the conventional answer would be that he doesn't have as clear a base as he did in 2016, when he could present himself as the single alternative to Hillary Clinton, and clearly Clinton came to the primaries with a lot of baggage and a lot of Democratic supporters who are a little skeptical of her. And now, if you are a progressive Democratic voter, you have other options. You have Elizabeth Warren. You have, the number of candidates is so large that I think if I sat down and tried to write down all 23 of them, I might get to 15. But he's not the only option in the race, and that can have the effect of splitting off or cleaving people who would otherwise. I mean, if it was a race between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, it would look more like a reprise of 2016. But now you've got Harris, you've got Klobuchar, you have a bunch of other candidates who are competing for the mantle of the progressive alternative, and that to me would be the simplest explanation of why Bernie Sanders is polling 17% instead of 40 and 45, because there are other possibilities. I mean, I think, again, the conventional way of framing this would be that wing of the party is probably going to come down to a choice between Sanders and Warren. But there could easily be another 5, 10, 12% of the Democratic base that is looking for someplace to land.
Yeah, and I mean, as you said before, like as candidates drop out, it's just going to be chaotic. So, is there a chance that he regains some of that ground that he's lost?
Uh, of course, certainly, possibly. I mean, I think the dynamic is likely to be over the next 3 or 4 months. You will see some of the the one percenters dropping out. They just won't be able to maintain an organization and raise money, and their ability to try to make the case will begin to become even more overwhelmed by the press attention and organization and advertising of the top candidates. But I mean, I would be very cautious about looking at the poll results or at this point and thinking, I mean, I think the likelihood is almost one that the ordering of the candidates, even the top four or five candidates, is going to look different in January of 2020 than it does now. I mean, that's just kind of the nature of this. Again, the farther away we are from the election, the less informative these poll results will be as far as predictive.
Well, and that brings me to Joe Biden, because he's polling at 38% right now. And there's been this lively debate in a lot of the press. 538's gotten involved, the kind of stat press, about how much that means he's an actual presumptive frontrunner, presumptive nominee. Do you have an opinion on that? Are people overreading the polls even when it comes to Biden's big share?
Well, you think about the heuristic that informed observers use when they evaluate who's the front runner. Some of it is a function of experience and how well known they are. Some of it is a function of the polls. I mean, there's a lot of some of it is a function of fundraising, and so I think it is an accurate statement to say that at this point in the race, the available information indicates that Biden is the front runner, but front runners don't always win. Front runners usually win. I don't know what the empirical evidence would suggest that a candidate who is in the lead with 38% of the vote, how much that means. And I know that there's no precedent for a 24 candidate race, thinking about what that means. But uh, a, a forecast, a classification as a front runner, if we think about it as from an academic standpoint, that's a probabilistic statement that if you were to take this race with the information you have and could somehow simulate the race 1,000 times, it's possible that Biden would win in a majority of them. But go back to June or July of 2015 when Donald Trump announced. I mean, there was virtually nobody who thought that he was not even a realistic candidate, but a credible candidate. And he dispatched a field that was comprised of current and former senators, current and former governors, people who had achieved notoriety, and think about by the end of the primary, by the Ohio primary or Indiana primary, it was down to Trump, Cruz, and Kasich. And I mean, it's as a matter of sort of how we understand this information, yeah, Biden is the front runner, but that doesn't mean that what that means is that he probably has a higher probability of winning the nomination than any of the other candidates right now. But that doesn't mean that it's 90% or even 80 or 60%. It might be that he's got a 40% chance of winning when the other 60% is going to be split among the other 23 candidates.
And so Elizabeth Warren, she's been quietly gaining in the polls in recent weeks. What are some of the things that you think she's doing that are helping her? And is there anything she could do to help keep growing that support?
Well, the thing that strikes me about Warren is that she, I think more so than the other candidates, is really articulating policy, that she is focusing on advancing plans of what she wants to do. And I mean, what a candidate, what helps a candidate if they become a meme. And I'm not a very sophisticated Twitter user, but I do remember a couple of months ago when there was someone who asked her for dating advice, and it became a joke that Warren has a plan for that. And that's affecting the way that reporters are covering her, that she's getting a lot of favorable coverage, which is a little different from Biden. That a lot of Biden's coverage is, my sense is that there's more coverage for Biden about gaffes and things that he says that sort of cause people to sort of scratch their heads, and it's just Uncle Joe being Uncle Joe. But you don't see that about Biden. You don't see that about Harris. You don't. I mean, it's the way in which the candidates are being described is a little bit different, and whether or not she is going to be able to build on this to go from 7 or 11% to 20, 25, and be seen as an alternative to Biden. But this is someone who is clearly accustomed to making complex arguments and thinking on her feet. And that would be the thing that I would watch on the first night, is how Warren, who is of the candidates that first night, she is the one who is in the lead. And will she be training her arguments against Biden and Sanders on the second night, or does she worry about the other candidates on the first night? But I think it's unlikely that Warren is going to be in a position where she says something that is, sort of profoundly gaffish. That just doesn't quite seem how she works.
So I guess the one last thing I'll ask you, and then I'll let you go, is this is a chaotic situation, and I think a lot of people are looking for something to cling to. What kind of advice would you give somebody watching this in terms of processing everything that's going on?
Well, what I tell my students is that it can be helpful to be aware that everybody processes information through their priors. And so, and even being aware of that doesn't mean that you don't do it. But understanding that if you are coming to this debate and you are inclined towards Sanders, or you're inclined towards Warren, or Harris, or any of the candidates, to sort of be cognizant of how those priors affect how you evaluate what the other candidates say. And uh, this is something that's harder to do in a general election debate because opinions are hardened and the number of people who are truly undecided is pretty small. But a Democratic voter has to be thinking, who do they support? Who do they think has the best chance of winning in November? So I think my default position in a case like this, where you can't really articulate a a solution or a closed form set of rules about here's what you need to watch for, and here are the foundations of making or changing a decision. But just to be aware how our prior views affect the way that we process and assimilate information, and I think that can be pretty useful.
Thank you, Kenneth. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate you taking the time.
It's my pleasure to talk to you. I hope we get a chance to do this again.